Hello, everyone. I'm Todd Williams, and I'd like to welcome you to our Essential Housing 2035 live event. As Chief Investment Officer here at Grubb Properties, I'm honored to host our esteemed panelists as we explore the themes, challenges, and opportunities that will shape the landscape for essential housing over the next decade. At a time when our industry is really focusing on current recovery, think COVID, inflation, interest rates, capital market dislocation, and other things. And now, most recently, the Fed pivot. We're planning for the future and really trying to think about, creating vibrant and sustainable communities and what those communities might look like 10 years from now. So we believe that the upcoming discussions will be informative and hopefully lively, and will underscore our commitment to helping lead the multifamily industry going forward. So for many of you who know us, and for those of you that may be new to Grubb Properties, let me just provide a little bit of background as a reminder. We're a company that was founded in 1963. We're a vertically integrated real estate company that's focused on essential housing through our national brand called Link Apartments. Link Apartments serves residents that are in the middle of the income spectrum and is the underserved demographic in multifamily housing today that's really faced with critical housing shortfall. And that has been around for some time and looks like it will be around for at least another decade plus, well into the mid 2030s. So to reach these residents, through our essential housing program, we focus on three key principles: price point, and that's really cost basis on one side of the equation, and a compelling rent profile for the resident on the other side. Location, which is really focusing on urban locations near major job centers and near major transportation alternatives. And then finally, design, which is near and dear to my heart as a recovering architect and urban planner, where we focus on efficiency and resident productivity and satisfaction. And so we'll obviously see how some of that interfaces with some of the ideas as we continue to explore that with our panelists. So we're excited to hear from our panelists, and they will provide certainly some insights into what might shape the multifamily industry over the next 10 years. And so to kick off the discussion, let me introduce our first panelist. Aliya Bagewadi is the U.S. Director of Strategic Partnerships at Lume Energy. She's the climate tech leader that is dedicated to ensuring the clean energy transition and that it fosters more inclusive and equitable economy for us here in the U.S. And as the U.S. Director of Strategic Partnerships at Lume, she leads the company's expansion to unlock rooftop solar for apartments and for apartment renters. And so welcome, Aliya, and thanks for joining us today. So let's kick things off by asking, what role can solar energy play in the future of essential housing over the next decade? Sorry, Aliya, I think you're...
I was on mute this whole time. Oh, I told myself not to do that, and I still did it. Thank you so much for having me, Todd. Is it possible to actually bring up my slides? Is that possible?
Yes. Sorry, I meant to do that. Yep. Perfect.
No problem. Thank you. All right. So what role can solar energy play in the future of essential housing over the next decade? So it is such a new industry that it's worth understanding where we are at right now. And if you go to the next slide, I want to communicate that rooftop solar is absolutely booming. It's proliferating, and especially on single family homes. But multifamily residents and multifamily buildings have historically been left out. So less than 1% of apartments currently have solar on them. And that's obviously unfortunate when you think that about half the country lives in multifamily buildings. So if you go to the next slide, you have to ask the question, why is that the case, right? So There's also a split incentive issue. So historically, it was very difficult for the benefits of rooftop solar to clearly flow to the asset owner, to property owners who would be making that investment. Typically, they would flow to tenants. And in order for tenants to actually consume solar, they needed to have multiple solar systems per unit, which is a lot of equipment. And even if a building did pursue solar, it was hard to track how solar was benefiting that building. I'm sure you all can speak to the challenges of actually tracking scope 2 emissions and tenant emissions. It's hard to tell, how is it lowering carbon emissions? How is it benefiting resident energy bills? So here's what it looks like. In that picture, you can see what the amount of equipment that's required to connect 20 units to separate systems. So it's a lot of equipment. And the only available programs to multifamily residents have typically relied on community solar programs, which are policy dependent. So 20 states in the country don't have policies that enable community solar. And community solar also relies on credit values that you're exporting to the grid, which is unfortunately decreasing across the country. The next slide. Because it's creating a major disparity gap for multifamily residents still. Because multifamily buildings haven't had that same access to the income savings of rooftop solar, there is this gap that's contributing to the further economic disparity. So the average single family homeowner spends about 3% of their income on energy bills, whereas low income multifamily residents are likely to spend upwards of 20% of their income on energy bills. So that disparity in access does matter, and it can make a significant financial impact on multifamily residents. And perhaps most importantly for multifamily building owners, is that without access to things like solar and storage, their buildings are more vulnerable to blackouts and extreme weather events and the increasing retail energy prices, which have gone up by 30% in the past decade. But it isn't all doom and gloom. Like, I wouldn't be here if that was the case. So there are new technologies like ours that are unlocking rooftop solar for multifamily buildings. And in the next decade, I foresee solar on multifamily buildings, not only to proliferate for the benefits it provides to building owners, but also be supported by governments for those benefits to low-income communities. So I would say that we're really at the cusp of multifamily building owners seeing that they can improve the profitability of their buildings by creating a new sustainability amenities like EV charging and like solar energy. So, okay, well, let me stop there.
No, that's perfect. Thank you. Tell me, one of the things that we've struggled with, historically in the past is challenges with the utility companies, the state regulations, how that's different from state to state. And, as a national multifamily operator, can you talk a little bit about, how those challenges, are across the industry, and then, maybe how you're addressing those or tackling those to, someday make this, a true possibility in multifamily housing?
Yeah, absolutely. So, in different states have different policies, energy policies, and then utilities within those states have different policies. So it is a extremely complicated landscape to navigate. And when you have programs like community solar, those are front of the meter programs. So those are dictated by what the utility is going to value that solar energy at. What we're doing is we're creating behind the meter technologies. So that is customer owned or asset owner owned infrastructure that allows a lot more control and scalability because you don't have to rely on utility programming. So with that, I think maybe it might be helpful if I just kind of spoke about our technology, if that's helpful.
That would be terrific. I think, that's actually one of the questions was, really what, how does your technology work, and how does it get implemented in a particular multifamily project?
Yeah. Well, obviously I'd love to talk about that. So essentially what we're doing is we are unlocking rooftop solar for multifamily residents. And if you can go to the next slide. What is it? What is our technology? It's a hardware solution called SolShare, and it's a smart hardware that takes a single rooftop solar system and shares the energy to multiple meters in a multifamily building. and it's controlled by software, which gives the owner, the asset owner, new control over the system. So if a tenant moves out, you can simply redistribute energy to elsewhere in the building. And the software also reports on the renewable energy distribution in the building, which really enables more concrete ESG reporting and stronger compliance. If we go to the next slide, kind of speaking to how SoulShare is unlocking this industry, or creating a new industry, I would say. We're sharing energy between common meters and tenant meters, so both stakeholders can lower their energy expenditures. We're also lowering the upfront costs that give of all of that equipment that's required, that was historically required. So now here's what you can see of what it looks like with 20 units connected to just 2 SoulShares. And I think what's really important here is that by the building owner sharing energy with their resident, building owners can create new revenue streams and recuperate their investment with an amenity fee for providing that solar access to the tenants. So on average, we're seeing that this increases net operating income by about $200 to $300 per unit per year, and simultaneously lowers that tenant utility bill by about $300 to $750 a year. And I just want to quickly show you what it looks like, if that's okay.
Sure.
So on the next slide, you can actually see a diagram. So you take a single rooftop solar system, the energy goes down, hits an inverter, and then hits the SoulShare. And then the SoulShare is physically pushing the electrons to multiple meters. And the allocation of that energy is really up to the building owner. So you can allocate the energy by square footage or have an equal allocation. You can decide to max out the common meter or max out tenant meters, whatever your building really needs. So yeah, that is essentially in a nutshell how the SoulShare works. And I really quickly want to just show you a case study on the next slide. Todd told me I have 10 minutes, so that's why I'm speeding through this. So here's a case study of a project that we did in Orlando, Florida, connecting 64 units to a shared solar system. And that's contributing to a 60% grid usage reduction for tenants, saving them about $100 per month.
Wow. I mean, that's a pretty tremendous amount of savings for the tenants in that property. And out of curiosity, in that particular property, how does that benefit the owner? If you could, expand on that side.
Yeah, I'd love to. So you preempted my next slide. So if we go to the next slide, essentially how does the net operating income boost happen? The shared solar will lower your OpEx cost with lower energy bills and increase income via these new revenue streams from the solar. It can either be a flat amenity fee, or building owners can create new power purchasing agreements with their residents. And our distribution data enables that accuracy. So in the case of that Florida project, that ostensibly amounted to about $16,000 per year, or in the first year for that building. And I want to go to the next slide about the asset owner. So here's an asset owner that we worked with in Jackson, Mississippi. Asset owners can get a wide array of benefits. So they can lower their carbon emissions by about 2 tons per year to support their sustainability or ESG goals. They can take advantage of available tax credits and solar programs, which are significantly lowering the cost of solar, especially in low-income areas. They get to have control over that asset. They have software that reports on common ESG metrics, which enables more simplified compliance and reporting. And property values go up with solar, so typically about 8 to 13%. Furthermore, tenant satisfaction goes up with lower utility bills, which means building occupancy goes up, further improving building profitability. So there's a lot to be said about the market that we're in which residents are increasingly environmentally conscientious and want to live in sustainable buildings that have a lower carbon footprint. And this to the next slide, for new technologies, for those who are early adopters, there's a significant amount of press that also comes with being the first to do something. So this is just some of the press that a building owner has gotten from pursuing a project, that kind of project. It's newsworthy. A news outlet covered that Mississippi building owner, And it's a great story. It further helps with branding and getting one's name out there and getting positive recognition for the work if that's desired.
That's terrific. It really feels like kind of a win-win-win, in that it helps to lower resident cost, which is, total cost of housing, not just, the rent aspect, but also their utility cost in this case. Um, it helps improve, both revenue and lower expenses on the owner side, which is, typically, with, folks like us, we have investors that benefit from that in terms of the performance of their buildings. And then, obviously with the market recognition, for a group like ourselves that provides the opportunity for us to attract more capital, attract interest from large institutional investors that value ESG and other aspects of this part of the business. So really, really intriguing. And thank you so much, Aliya. I think what we'll do right now is I'm going to pivot and we'll turn to renowned journalist, author, and researcher Henry Grabar. Henry writes about or writes the Metropolis column for Slate and recently authored Paved Paradise: How Parking Explains the World, which was named one of the best books of 2023 by the New Yorker and the New Republic. His work has also appeared in media, including the New York Times, the Atlantic, the Wall Street Journal, 99% Invisible, Bloomberg City Lab, and Architectural Record. Welcome, Henry.
Thanks for having me.
And pardon me just a moment as I switch back to the other slideshow here. And there's a little bit of bullets on your background so everybody can see that. So Henry is one of the nation's really leading experts on, the nexus of housing and transportation. Can you kind of begin to tell us, why we would consider them to be integrated, part of the same, two sides of the same coin, if you will?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the first thing to think about when we think about housing, well, this is a cliche in real estate broker language, but it's location, 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 right? And so we have a very spiky situation going across the country in terms of how much various homes are worth, to the extent that, a house in the suburbs of Boston might be worth 10 or 20 times as much as an identical house in an identical neighborhood in the suburbs of Flint, Michigan. So that is because location is important, and location is important both because of access to various metropolitan economies, but also because where you live is only as close to things as the transportation network that you are on. So that could mean roads, it could mean mass transit, it could mean something as simple as sidewalks, but the value of the places we live is derived from their proximity to other things. And that is obviously a matter of transportation. So the value of housing and the utility of transportation are intimately connected.
So you've I know you've said that cities have really lost kind of their focus on tried and true methods of transportation and have gotten distracted, by really some of the flashy technology. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Sure. So I think I have seen many cities contemplate, for example, expanding their bus network only to backtrack and decide that they don't need to do that because autonomous vehicles are going to come along and sweep everybody up. And so something as old-fashioned as the bus will no longer be relevant. But we've been hearing these promises about the imminent arrival of autonomous vehicles to ferry everybody around, electric helicopters, all kinds of sort of newfangled ideas to get people from A to B. And those inventions in some case do show great promise, but it does not replace the fundamental utility of something as simple as the bus, the bicycle, or the elevator, which are the three sort of, I think, transportation technologies that I think are overlooked when we think about how to make the most of the urban environment that we have. We can do a lot with buses to relieve ourselves from traffic congestion and build more housing in the places people most want to live without spending billions of dollars to construct capital-intensive capital projects. Bicycles are a miraculous technology, especially with e-bikes now, that make short distance mobility possible for all types of people, and they're also fun to ride. And then elevators, I think, are also a transportation technology that often gets overlooked in this discussion. If we're going to figure out how to solve the housing shortage that we've built ourselves into over the last decade or so, the elevator is going to be probably more important than the autonomous vehicle in doing that. And that's because one thing that we can do is take these neighborhoods where, again, everybody wants to live with access to jobs and amenities and shops and so forth, and build up. And that, of course, requires putting in a bunch of new elevators.
So it's interesting. Parking, of course, is related to transportation, obviously because of the continued reliance still on the automobile, especially in America. And parking has been something that we've been very, very focused on at Grubb Properties in terms of reducing it or sharing it to mitigate the cost of it because it's such an impact on housing. Tell us a little bit about the progress that you've witnessed in terms of parking policy reforms across the U.S. You probably see it more broadly than we do. We're in roughly 13 major metropolitan markets. Do you think the march towards reform here will continue over the next decade? And if so, how?
I do. So just to back up for people who might not be well versed in parking policy, I think parking kind of lies at the intersection of transportation and land use. I mean, it's obviously a big part of the pro forma when you're developing housing and a big part of the site. But obviously, it's also intimately connected to the way that people get around, whether they own cars, how often they drive the cars. Those rates are closely connected to the availability of free on-site parking at, say, an office or something like that. So you need to understand parking to understand both housing and transportation. And over the last 10 years, what we've seen is lots of communities changing their zoning laws around parking. From about 1950 to the present day, almost every jurisdiction in the United States adopted a piece of their zoning code that requires a certain amount of parking at every site. So many zoning codes say you need to provide 2 parking spaces with every new unit of housing or something like that, right? But this also applies to shops, it applies to offices, it applies to grocery stores, bowling alleys, tennis courts, you name it. And the effect that these laws have had on the urban environment has been very powerful because they have required a lot of free parking to be built in, and that has pushed buildings away from each other. And it has provided an enormous amount of parking to the extent that we now have, I think, at least 3 parking spaces for every car in this country, according to most data. And what that means on a metropolitan level is that the urban environment has been kind of disintegrated by the presence of all this parking. So the change has been to stop requiring this. And builders have been taking advantage of this and saying, you know what, we're going to be smarter with parking. We're going to be building less of it. We might charge for it. We might share it between different uses that have different demands at different times of day. And all of this has been very successful because I think there's a lot of desire to reform the system. And politically, it's a winning issue. And one of the reasons for that is that these parking requirements have impeded our ability to create affordable housing. But the other reason is because I think it just feels like an impediment that the government places on your ability to do what you want to do with your property that hasn't really been backed up by common sense or evidence. And so these laws have fallen away, and I expect they will continue to fall away over the years to come.
Henry, speaking of public policy and parking and the opportunity of reduced or shared parking, as a former urban planner, one of the big benefits is the benefit it can have on the urban environment, the Main Street urban environment. Can you talk a little bit about that, and what are some of the friction points that you run into with respect to some of these issues?
Virtually every town or city in the United States believes that they suffer from a parking shortage. It is the great uniter in our very divided country that we all believe there's not enough parking spaces. And another thing that unites us is that there mostly is enough parking. You just don't necessarily know where it is, and it's not being properly priced or shared. And so this is important, right? When you think about the viability of a downtown, and that's for a few reasons. One is that if you decide that you must constantly be increasing the parking supply with every new thing you build, somebody once put it to me this way: it's like you're expanding the seating at an auditorium by taking pieces of the stage, right? And so you expand the seats and you expand the seats, but you're shrinking the actual thing that people came to see. And that is very much the case in many cities where we have literally demolished blocks after block after block of downtowns in order to create more parking. And at a certain point, you begin to quote unquote solve the parking shortage, but you also find yourself in a place where you've taken away a lot of that urban environment. So that's why it's important to manage it, right? To price that prime parking right in front of local businesses, to encourage turnover, to get people who might be parked there all day to park a little further away. And this stuff isn't rocket science. I mean, Don Shoup, the professor at UCLA who wrote The High Cost of Free Parking, he outlined all this stuff. He codified it 20 years ago. And it was known to the people who invented the parking meter back in 1935 that this was the only way we had to manage this scarce resource in congested downtown locations. But if you don't do it, you do find yourself building your way into a parking crisis. And unfortunately, that's what a lot of American cities did. They destroyed the very thing that people wanted to drive to.
That's fascinating. Speaking of cities, could you give us a flavor, maybe some examples of cities that are kind of getting it right, in your opinion, in terms of parking reform, and what lessons can other cities that haven't been down that path yet take from that? So, for example, we're struggling with a city where we own an asset in the Atlanta market, the city of Dunwoody, and they've been fairly resistant to rental housing and shared parking, and that's been something that we've struggled with in terms of entitlements in that market. So I'd love to know where cities are getting it right, what other cities are thinking about this could take.
I think one place that often gets cited as an example of how to get parking policy right is Boulder, Colorado. So Boulder has a pretty vibrant downtown with a lot of shops and businesses. And one of the reasons that's the case is that Boulder has never required these downtown entities to each come with their own parking lot adjacent to the structure, which is, of course, what most zoning codes do require. And instead of doing that, Boulder built some publicly owned facilities that provide parking for the entire district. So not only do you have everybody parking in one place, which preserves the integrity of the urban fabric and gets those drivers out on their feet, walking through the neighborhood, which in turn creates foot traffic, which comes with its own benefits in terms of safety, in terms of spontaneous spending at various establishments along the route. But the other thing is the city's in charge of these facilities. And so they can, for example, make sure that parking rates in the garage are cheaper than parking rates on the street, because everybody would prefer to park on the street than in the garage. So by adjusting those prices to make curb parking more expensive than garage parking, you provide a little nudge towards drivers who are going to be there all day to say, hey, you should put the car in the garage, leave these street spaces available to somebody who might need to run an errand for 20 minutes. And then finally, with Boulder, one thing they've done is they take the revenue from that, which more than pays for the garages, and then they dedicate that extra revenue to buying bus passes for local employees at downtown businesses. So that further discourages people from driving downtown and enhances the walkability of that neighborhood.
No, that's a terrific example. One other thing that's probably obvious, but it might be worth just touching base on before we pivot to Matt here is obviously a lot of what we're talking about is integrated with sustainability and can be a mitigant to climate change. Can you talk a little bit about those two subjects relative to this?
The number one source of greenhouse gas emissions in the United States is transportation, and most of that comes from driving. And the reason for that is that even as our vehicles have become more efficient, Americans have responded to that increased efficiency by buying bigger, heavier vehicles, pickup trucks, SUVs, et cetera, which now dominate the new vehicle market in the United States. And so compounding that is the fact that many people now have been pushed by high housing prices into locations at the periphery of metropolitan areas where they have to do lots and lots of driving every day. And this relates to parking because the concern over parking is one of the reasons that all that housing gets built at the urban fringe rather than in close-in neighborhoods. Now, there are many ingredients to NIMBYism. I'm sure we've all seen examples of this in our own communities, but one that comes up over and over again is the resistance to new neighbors as a potential threat to the parking supply, right? And so to the extent that we can figure out parking, find a way to manage this resource, find a way to help people get around without their cars so much, we can build the housing in the places where people won't need to drive so much. And so there is a kind of virtuous cycle that we could unlock through better parking policy. And that would have terrific implications for the environment, both because of less driving and fewer emissions, but also if we had people driving less, we would have less local pollution, fewer accidents and fatalities on the road, and other benefits. And that's to say nothing of the local environmental effects, right? Because building all this parking contributes to the urban heat island effect. It uses lots of concrete and asphalt. And finally, it creates and adds to our stormwater management problem, right? Because we take all this natural land and we seal it up under asphalt and concrete with these relatively low value uses that do not contribute a lot of money to pay for sewer upgrades or something like that.
That's fascinating. Thank you. I could talk about this subject all day. Thank you so much, Henry. I'm going to pivot now, and I'd like to welcome Matthew Gray, who's the founder and executive chairman of BuiltWorks. Hopefully I pull up the right slide here. Which is BuiltWorks is a leading research platform, advisory and professional network for innovation and innovators within the world of infrastructure and buildings. Matt is also a co-chairman of Graycore, which is a leading Chicago-based construction and related services firm with more than $1 billion in construction and planning underway throughout North America. He's the managing partner of Great Capital Partners, which is a private commercial real estate and infrastructure investment fund. So welcome, Matt.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Yeah, there's I'll tell you there's something about being the last speaker. There's so much that was said before this presentation that my mind is running a lot of directions. But fortunately, you gave me a few things you wanted to hit on, and if you wouldn't mind advancing the slides, I'll just take you through
Sure.
The things that I think I was asked to kind of focus on. Just briefly for everybody's benefit, BuiltWorks is a company that I started in 2013 because as an operator of active businesses in this sector and an investor in this sector, I really wanted better data and information about where the industry might be heading. And I couldn't find it. So I built the company myself. And fortunately, as we grew our analyst team and began gathering data via our digital platform about trends and technologies and inventory the technologies and understanding the trends, others wanted to have access to the same kind of information that I had. And so we built this group out that way. And so now I think what I can walk you through is I can share with you some of the examples of some of the different, we can kind of spin through some of these slides. I know we want to have time for people to have questions, and I'm sure there's a lot of questions and some interesting discussion. if there's interest, you can always go to our website. I will say it's probably worth noting it is a global network at this point. So my remarks and the data that we collect is from companies all over the world. As it happens, questions of how all of the questions and topics that have been discussed so far. I'm sitting in Paris right now, having just been had meetings in London and then in Madrid, and then again, yeah, we'll have them here. And all of the kinds of issues that we're grappling with in the United States are issues that people in our sector are grappling with all around the world. So it becomes a really interesting the world becomes a really interesting laboratory for understanding the approaches that different companies and different cities are taking around the world to addressing these kinds of problems. So, so when I speak, I'll cite some of the companies just to like give you a sense. The other thing is it's a tremendous cross section of stakeholders in this exercise to really think about where the industry is headed, and so it's I think people are sometimes surprised by the variety of stakeholders who really have a role to play and are really thinking about how the world is going to change to address these solutions, and then in turn how their own businesses are going to change. And this gives you a little bit of a sample. But I guess to dive into the specific questions you asked me about in terms of specific areas in which we see companies developing, and now we've cataloged, I don't know how many, 30 some thousand companies in the sector. And I will say they're at all stages of development now. Some of them very, very early, some of them much more mature. But certainly this whole question of permitting, zoning, managing the permitting process, there are a variety of solutions that are being developed. And some of those solutions, like Symbiom, allow developers to look more quickly at, it was mentioned earlier, that just the Byzantine nature of all of the codes and all of the zoning regulations. And so an effort really to help companies really think, hey, if I'm looking to site this type of a multifamily building and I have these types of parameters, where specifically, what am I up against in each specific area? And I think again that's an area of technology where I mean, it was 2013 when Google, if anybody's on the call recalls, Google spun out their first Google X project, which was a company called Flux, and Flux started Flux Metro, and really was going to be aimed at being able to help people suck in all the relevant data and really look at different pieces of land and really understand what you can do with the land. And so there's been a lot of focus ever since then on that particular idea. AI is helping because it's so much data that has to be aggregated and interpreted. But I think the other thing that's interesting that we'll start to see happen in this arena, because we see it in other places, is it kind of starts with these workflow automation sort of systems, collecting data, structuring data, helping people manage processes more smoothly. But then people can begin to derive insights from that data, which can help inform questions like the ones that were just discussed about, well, gee, should we really are we really lacking parking? Or maybe we have the data that really shows us now, hey, we actually have plenty of parking. So I think these technologies will begin to evolve in ways that add actually more value. Similarly, so that's kind of at the broader permitting and zoning level, but then within the actual efforts to design the buildings themselves, there are a lot of very nervous architects and engineers running around these days, because systems are getting much better. It's the computational design, again, it's been around for a long time, but increasingly the ability to apply that technology to develop designs, to look at different prototypes more quickly, to iterate, is really advancing. And so we're seeing that, and these are schema, test fit, paraffin are all examples of that. I would point out, if you go back to the slide one time, I don't know if I'm, there is this company, Shibuya Systems, and they're a little different because they're really providing data about standardizing the inputs into housing, and that whole question of supply chain rationalization and standardization, which I know is an element of Grubb's strategy, is just a really significant and sometimes underappreciated aspect of this entire effort. So I just want to highlight them. Okay, you can go forward,
Yeah,
and I'll buzz through these more. Yeah, I mean, there's just, again, there's an awful lot here, and I know we're limited on time, so but I'm gonna try to hit the questions you asked.
Sure.
So again, just spinning through, I kind of am tracing. I reorganized your questions. I hope it's okay. I reorganized them so they made sense to me in terms of the life cycle of buildings. So I started with zoning and planning, and then into design and development, and then some things around materials. Obviously, you get into construction, and then you move into all of the operations tech. So BrainBox, automated logic. Now we're moving into some of the post. These are particular technologies that are particularly focused on optimizing the mechanicals and the electricals in buildings. You can go to the next. There's a whole universe of these kinds of companies. Another massive area, but again, and I love that this was 2035, because I think, the hype cycle is such, people get really excited about things and then they get really frustrated because like it just doesn't seem to be happening. You have to really step back and look at the way things are changing over a longer period of time. And I was taught once, we had a conference on building products and materials, that it typically takes 20 to 25 years to commercialize a new building product or material. So these are not things that are going to happen immediately, but they are happening. And so I just highlighted some of the areas. Concrete, incredible efforts going on in concrete. It's ubiquitous, the most common building material, the most commonly consumed thing on the planet after water. It's really critical to this whole equation. But there's other low carbon materials also in development. Maybe skip to the next slide. There's like just way too much that could be said about that. You asked about 3D printing. I mean, look, 3D printing, kind of a joke at various points, but there are unmistakable advances in robotics. I mean, the meeting we had in Madrid was a summit on robotics and construction, and it was all very speculative 10 years ago. There was nothing in really commercial use, and today there's more than a dozen robotics type companies that are actually in use in construction projects where the contractors are using them repeatedly. So there is progress there, and I imagine it will continue. But then, by the same token, I threw Gropius up again. I'm in Europe right now. Gropius just raised $100 million. I can't remember whether it's dollars or euros, but anyway, and they're really spending a lot of money on implementing robotics, but in the fab shop and prefabrication. I think they've raised 300 million so far. So there's a lot of people love to sort of trash on the modular builders and the offsite and Katerra, blah blah blah. And there's lots of failures. There's a really high capex, but underneath the failures, there's lots of other companies that are doing it just fine and growing in this arena. Okay, so so you build a building, and probably folks are familiar with a lot of these companies, Lively and Alfred, and HQO has all of these companies that are focused on There's kind of the energy management people, there's sort of the access people, there's the tenant experience folks. Some of those are taking angles to help unlock some offset income opportunities for asset managers. So there's just a lot of there still is a lot developing here. We're a long way from the old just security systems and did somebody leave the door open or not. Okay, next slide. Okay, that's it.
Yep. No, that's terrific, Matt. Really appreciate it. The range of innovation that's going on is pretty fascinating, and the number of companies that are being spawned as a result of that innovation is really fascinating to see. And I've always felt like the industry has been a pretty sleepy industry up until the last decade or so, and relying on really old methodologies. And it does seem like there is a lot of innovative thinking going into this area now, which is refreshing and encouraging about the next decade or so.
Yeah, I mean, there's just billions and billions of dollars of venture capital has now been invested in this sector, really starting in 2016, 2017. And prior to that, I mean, the amount of investment over the last 7 years compared to the prior period is just so significant. And that's kind of an external factor influencing the state of things in the industry. So
I mean, that's great to hear.
part
And
of it.
I'm obviously encouraged to have somebody like you that's trying to map it all out and provide those resources to a larger group of folks that could potentially tap into some of these resources. With that, I'm going to pivot to maybe some follow-on questions that I might ask each of you, and I'll just start with multifamily housing in particular, and just thinking about 2035. What are some of the things that that you think our industry should be thinking about in particular to reach its full potential? And obviously we've touched base on a lot of different things. I think it would be great if we could think about kind of what that 2035 world looks like in housing. And Aliya, maybe I'll just start with you. Obviously, I imagine it probably has something to do with solar, but it would be great to kind of in more big picture vision, what would you think would be successful in the housing world in 2035 from your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I'll speak to from the energy lens. I think there will be much stronger bridges between the real estate sector and the energy sector, and that's only being created right now. And so building owners are recognizing now that they can act as energy providers to their residents, which can provide a whole host of benefits to them and their residents. And I think that model will continue and proliferate, and or there will be increasing sort of leasing options for building owners to have on-site energy on site on their buildings. So energy will increasingly become more decentralized. And there's been a long argument that these distributed forms of energy aren't good for low-income communities because they have been the ones who have been left out from it. But with these new technologies that are specifically for multifamily buildings, that is incorporating multifamily into these distributed energy assets. So you can't make that argument anymore. And these kinds of distributed energy assets are doing so much benefit for communities. They're creating new jobs. They're building resiliency. They're lowering the cost of energy in the first place. So I think that trend will continue, and there will be further intersections between real estate property owners and the energy industry.
I think that's fascinating because I think old school thinking would say buildings were energy consumers, but to think of buildings as energy producers as well is like an entirely different mindset. And that could be a very fascinating 10-year horizon, just taking that as a thought. Henry, same question to you. Love to know your thoughts on kind of what housing should look like in 2035.
Well, we know that both presidential candidates have said that they are going to focus on providing more housing as a way of bringing down the cost of living. One thing I should have mentioned earlier with respect to transportation is that the two single largest items in the American household budget are housing and transportation. And so those are, and what's funny is they're often tied together because the places where people spend more on housing, they often spend less on transportation. Like if you live in New York, for example, you pay a fortune for a shoebox apartment, but you have instant access to every location in the city on the subway for, $100 a month, right? Which is probably less than most Floridians' car insurance payments. So that's part of the equation here. And I think as we think about 2035, we hope that there's going to be a lot of housing built over the next 10 years. And I think the question is, where does that housing get built? The previous big housing boom, obviously, in the aughts during the Bush administration, a lot of that housing was greenfield sprawl on the fringe of these metro areas, in particular in the Sun Belt. And I think that's not the best place to put housing from an environmental perspective, not the best place to put it from a traffic perspective, but also I wonder if some of these Sunbelt communities are going to begin to see the kind of NIMBY trend that we saw emerge in a place like Los Angeles, which for decades was a byword for breakneck housing growth, and then all of a sudden in the 1970s and 80s did a 180, and people said, you know what? Actually, we've had enough of this. And now Los Angeles is one of the hardest places to build housing in the United States. So I wouldn't be surprised to see that happen in the Sun Belt. And I think it just reinforces the fact that we need to think harder about how to streamline the approval and construction of infill housing in the neighborhoods where people most want to live, the most expensive places, close to city centers, close to jobs, et cetera. I think we're getting some of that. I think we've talked today about innovations both on the energy side and on the permitting and construction side that may be making it easier to get that stuff done. But obviously, local governments remain a serious obstacle, and it's not clear if either candidate in the presidential election wants to use the federal government to override that local land use authority. So I think over the next 10 years, I would expect to see more and more states stepping in to make sure that housing does get built. I think that's something to look out for.
That's terrific. Matt, you've got obviously an incredibly broad perspective on the various technologies that are being developed and various processes that are being looked at. What looks to be, from your perspective, the most promising for housing by 2035?
Okay. Yeah, two parts. I mean, one, I would say, just echoing what Henry says, I mean, if you look around the world, I mean, that seems to be the policy folks seem to be very focused on this question of how to get more density, smaller units in places where there's already transit, more urban areas. And you see that in the UK, you see that in Canada, where they're basically saying, hey, if you want money for streets and roads and water mains and so forth, then you're going to have to ease your restrictions and allow more smaller unit, denser housing. So that's certainly something that's occurring. It's not really a technology thing, but it's just more of a policy thing. I think from a technology front, the other thing that there's a lot of focus on, Chad Syverson and Austin Goolsbee, who of course led the National Affordable Health Care Act, now chairman of the Chicago Fed, had a lot to say about had some points made which made it into the Economic Council's recommendation, Biden administration Economic Council report in March around industrialization and manufacturing. So I do think there's going to be an effort at supporting more modularization, offsite construction, and seeing if you get that to scale and you rationalize the supply chain, can you actually lower the cost of building? Because ultimately, I think if the construction industry goes through the same type of modernization as other industries, you can create a ton of steel today with about 10 to 20% of the labor that it took 30 years ago. So, if we achieve those kinds of efficiency gains in construction, and if industrializing the approach to construction enables that, then obviously that could have serious impact in terms of lowering the cost of housing. So I think it's a very challenging road. The supply chain rationalization, standardization, standardizing design, and industrialization effort within multifamily, but it's probably one of the best candidate product types within the whole building arena for modularization and standardization and prefabrication. So I'm going to maybe put my money there.
Well, we're getting to pretty close to the top of the hour. Maybe just a quick round robin on one final question, and that's where do you see the big resistance points? What if you could wave sort of the magic wand you'd get rid of as a resistance point that would be very, very helpful to making some of these things a reality? And maybe Henry, I'll start with you on that.
Well, you know what I'm going to say. I really do think that traffic and parking are a major source of one of our failures to get this stuff built. Obviously, bringing the costs under control is important too. But if we could have these conversations as communities and just put to the side concerns about traffic and parking, then I think it would be a lot easier to get some of this stuff done.
Matt?
Yeah, I just think the intense fragmentation of the stakeholders in the process is the biggest hurdle to overcome. And so you just have so many different players involved from the time you go to think to create housing to the time you actually create the housing, and all of those players have different incentives. And if I could wave a magic wand and figure out how to align all those incentives, then I would do that.
That's terrific. I like that one. Aliya, I'll give you the last word. We started with you. We'll end with you, if that's okay.
Yeah, thanks, Todd. I'll end on a positive note. A challenge has been the lack of financing options for building owners to pursue these kinds of upgrades and pursue renewable energy in ways that actually suit them and their needs. What the good news is that there is so much new funding available from the federal government, $7 billion for solarizing low-income communities, with a focus of 30% of that for multifamily buildings. So that access to low-interest financing is now going to, or very soon, be readily available to pursue this, and will really enable building owners to do so.
That's terrific, and that's a great place to end. I first want to just thank our panelists and all of you for joining us on this journey this afternoon towards 2035. At Grubb Properties, we're particularly excited about the investment and development opportunities that we foresee in multifamily over the next 10 years. And we appreciate all your support. And if you'd like to learn more about our company and future events like this, you can follow us on LinkedIn or subscribe to our Essential Housing blog at grubbproperties.com. We're already working hard on our early 2025 virtual event, and we hope to see you there. Thank you again, and have a great day.